But tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mark Tewdwr-Jones. I guess usually the speakers in this series are distinguished visitors. Tonight we're really breaking with this tradition by introducing a distinguished, one of our own colleagues, Mark, who, albeit very recently, Mark joined the school just this summer. And I suppose, in effect, we're kind of reviving the rather dead tradition of the inaugural lecture tonight. So anyway, we're delighted that Mark came to join us here in Newcastle, following his previous posts at UCL, Aberdeen and Cardiff. And we're delighted that he's going to speak to us tonight. So without further ado, Mark, over to you.
Right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks from us, John. And I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be asked to give one of these APL lectures here at my new university. I'm also delighted so many of you came along. Maybe it was the film in the title that enticed people to come, wanting to see films as much as hear someone talk about film and place and planning and change. A warning sign on the very first PowerPoint slide. That's not a good sign, is it? Let's see if I can get rid of this with my eyesight as it is. Okay. I suppose the theme I'd like to develop this afternoon is on urban planning and urban change, but set within the context of film and photography, which from my disciplinary perspective, my usual disciplinary perspective, I suppose is something of an unusual occurrence. But being both an urban planner by background and also a film studies graduate, I can see opportunities of linking these two themes together to give us an alternative perspective of place and change and emotion and representation. For us to understand and learn more about distinctive places, what marks for distinctive places, while at the same time offering the potential to bridge design, social science, and the arts and humanities more fundamentally. Now, I realise, as an opening gambit, that's quite an ambitious objective, perhaps, but it's one I really truly believe in. You get innovation within disciplines, but also you get incredible innovation between disciplines. And this is where I'm coming from. For those of us actively involved with the analysis, interpretation, and design of places, I think it's fair to say also that often we neglect the meaning and representation of places, to look at places how others see them, rather than as experts or as professionals. And we live in a more media-dominated, media-savvy world than we've ever done. So traditional academic ways of looking at places and problems are perhaps not going to be sufficient in the future. So let me start off by talking to you about where I'm coming from. Is that going to work? No? That's not a good sign, is it? There you go. There I am, clearly influenced by television as a 3-year-old, pretending to be a Dalek, and looking rather delighted by it as well, it has to be said. And I can recall vividly as a young kid our family trips to Cardiff, our nearest city, Cardiff. And it was vast, or so I thought. Buildings, streets that went on as far as the eye could see. It had a castle and street names that were curiously Scottish in origin, not Welsh. But Cardiff in the late 60s and early 70s was changing. New high-rise office blocks built everywhere. City was a building site, as well as new roads, new dual carriageways skirting through gleaming new architecture. The pace and the noise of the place was memorable compared to our small village back home. And apart from the travelling distance and the fact we were in the city, the thing that stood out for me were the orange buses. I really knew we were in a different place because of orange buses. And likewise, when we used to go to Bristol or Weston-super-Mare, I knew we were in a different place there because the Bristol buses were green. So an early form of place distinctiveness and place identity. And I've always subscribed to this view about what drives us and what we can see and how those things represent us. And I've taken Calvino's statement here to heart, sorry about that, that the eye does not see things, but images of things that mean other things. And when you relate this to film, it becomes even more obvious, of course. I've always been influenced by observation, seeing things as they are, and no surprise that television and film should have a hold on me. A glance at the schedules of Radio Times for August 1973 reveals the sort of programmes I used to watch. I don't know if you can see them from there. You're supposed to be looking at that side of the screen, incidentally, not the offers on offer at Co-op at the moment. But essentially you have things like Magic Roundabout, Play School, Jackanory, even Nationwide, remember those programmes, coming in. Actually, this side of the screen is very interesting. You can get Kleenex for 10.5 pence, Jacob's Cream Crackers for 6 pence, and beef and bone broth with vegetables by Heinz as well. Anyway, it's a sign of the times, you could say. I digress. I was no doubt also influenced by places I saw depicted on screen, places I recognised, or at least thought I recognised. And the same can be said true for television productions and films as well. In the repeats of Prisoner, I thought I recognised some of the Welsh architecture in there, or is it Italian architecture in there? Places I really knew or perhaps didn't. Think of films, think of James Bond films, and the locations and the use of iconic architecture, particularly at the start of films as well, and how we recognise those places. Think of how New York or Manhattan is depicted in some of the Woody Allen films, for example. Alternatively, Alfred Hitchcock, who used film as a backdrop in a lot of his films, in this case, Vertigo in San Francisco. Or even for European cinema, and to Rome and the prevalence of the city in filmic features of the 50s and 60s, such as La Dolce Vita. Film has always been associated with urban change. And in fact, if you go back to one of the first ever motion pictures from 1893, 1894, this is workers leaving the Lumiere brothers' factory in Lyon. It was chosen because it depicted crowds and it depicted movement, exactly what you needed to do to demonstrate the art of the new equipment of the motion picture. But it was an urban location, one of those very first films. Chaplin looked at 20th century and modern times in the film of that name, and film after the 1930s sought to realistically capture urban change and urban conditions as it was being felt by the people themselves. This is Lewis Mumford's film of 1939 for the New York State Fair about promoting planning. And even in the UK, we embarked on the documentary movement through the 1930s and 1940s to show not just urban conditions and their problems, but also the case for planning in a propaganda sort of way. This is an aerial image from the 1946 film The Way We Live by Jill Craigie, a rank-release 70-minute propaganda film essentially about the need for Plymouth, and starring the academic man of the moment, Professor Sir Patrick Abercrombie of UCL, who is given the role in Plymouth of producing the plan and overseeing the reconstruction. Now I'm going to show you a series of film clips, you'd be pleased to know, providing I can work this technology, and the technology works for me. And one of the first films I'm going to show you is Abercrombie in Plymouth, in The Way We Live, which will demonstrate, hopefully, the style of the film at the time.
So they called in Professor Abercrombie, and the businessmen made history by inviting him to treat the city centre as an open site. Beyond that, nobody quite knew what the professor was up to. Here's a spot in the heart of the city where people can escape from the jostle of the crowds and go right back into the 16th century. What fine old buildings these are, with their thick walls, limestone and granite, built to weather the centuries, even stood up to the Blitz. This should be preserved, whatever happens. But in the new plan, we mustn't copy it. modern building should make an effective contrast. This is just the place to come to after attending a council meeting. They tried, the Victorians, but all they did was to fake the past. Still, it has given spaciousness, and I like the way they've given the civic buildings a square all to themselves. It's a precinct and simplifies traffic. We can do the same with our shops and offices. The old fishing quarters, but all falling into decay. Yet Americans swarm here on their way from the Mayflower Stone. What a pity it looks so drab. All it needs is a few new buildings to harmonize with the old, grass and trees, and perhaps a meeting place, sort of community center. And how pleasant it would be to sit overlooking the harbor and taste the fresh fish. On the continent, they cater for visitors. Here you'd think they weren't wanted. The ideal street for getting run over. Narrow, congested, every kind of traffic all muddled up. All it should be is a link between the city centre and the dockyard. There oughtn't to be any shops here at all. Plymouth needs pale colours to respond to the sunlight. Buildings in limestone and concrete. Flat and vertical masses to give balance and an interesting skyline. What's really needed is a city to cheer people up. But what was planning a city?
Right. An interesting, powerful film that's never been released on DVD, as you can see by the state of the quality of that film on YouTube there. But nevertheless, representing, if you like, a distinctive film style and the power and belief in planning, and with so-called planning wizards, to use John Gould's terminology, a belief in these people of vision to provide, if you like, the future cities. And it was very much this style of film which carried on for some time through the following 15 to 20 years. Right, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Excuse me. There's a problem using mixed media. So cities are physical constructs, as that film sort of demonstrated, but as Lefebvre remarks, the social construction of cities and places is a vital element in how people see the environment surrounding them. Representations evoke the real and the imagined. And the city and how it's represented in film and photography provides that unique perspective for us to consider urban places in ways that perhaps traditional social science often fails to do. Some of these perspectives are real, some are imagined, and some are total constructs. And that's the beauty of film. Now, cities, places, and urban change, and indeed people's perceptions of cities, places, and urban change are, I would argue, indecorously bound together. The utilisation of images, stories, and film from cultural sources is a very highly effective way to reflect not only upon different perceptions of place and urban change, but also on the role and status of the city itself. We all have prior perceptions of places, even if we've never set foot in a place in question. These perceptions have been formed from the media, from literature, from film, from historical developments, from literature, and from chance encounters. These perceptions of places continue to be peddled, not least by popular media representations of people and territories as well. These depictions are both representative of the place and are fictional characterizations of actual places. But the important point is that they communicate ideas of places that can sit heavily on people's emotions and sense of attachments to locations and their own ideas about the identity of and meaning of a place in the first place. So, let's look at the ubiquitous city backdrop. It serves to represent progress, the future, and in lots of other styles as well, of urban bridges, of gateways between different sorts of communities, of different sorts of skylines that perhaps we recognize in both actually where they are or actually what they're supposed to represent as well. And it could be anywhere that we're talking about, these sorts of skylines, because they've populated the world over. But we look at them through the means of film, and we can see judgments immediately about how things have changed over time, how something that was depicted some decades ago in a contemporary way becomes an historical film over time as well, of being on the right or wrong sides of the tracks in urban locations, of car chases, of crime caper getaways, of Cold War spy thrillers set in Eastern Europe. All these are employed in film narratives, and the place as film location can be important as the storyline itself. The camera lens is well positioned to provide this holistic interpretation of urban interventions and fluid change. I don't have many wordy slides, you'd be pleased to know. Film provides an opportunity for this critical alternative perspective that I've been talking about, that explain the prevalence or significance of people's perceptions of places, that often planners especially feel remote from or unable to discern. Film offers this means to represent and communicate different perspectives of place and change, sometimes accurately, sometimes not, as I've said, between different societies and groupings. But like maps, film is just another way of looking at the world. But it evokes matters concerning power and contestation as well, as maps do. So film can be an ideal means, an effective means, through which to criticize and ridicule and observe change as well, especially about people with city visions, with those ideas about urban future. And as our modern cities of glass and steel literally reflect older styles of design and interventions, film is useful to record that transition as well. There's a good example of this in film, and it's Jacques Tati's Playtime of 1967 that some of you will be familiar with, that dared to question the professional edict of the day and the modernist creations that were being created around them, especially in Paris, and suggesting that places are becoming ubiquitous, an early statement on globalization and the international style that seemed to chime with some audiences here. I've got a clip of that as well.
Please follow me. Is this the turn?
You have 2 hours before the bus. Now please be back at 5:30 sharp.
London.
8, 9, 10.
Barbara, come here. Let's see the sights. And what the book says, that should be... Let me see. The poet Alexandre Tewdwr. I'm sure it is. That'll be a good picture. Okay? Let's go.
Would you mind? That's really Paris. Hey, Donna. Please, I'd like to take a photo.
Oh,
that's all right. S'il vous plaît. Madame. It's just fine. Good. Hey, boys, do you mind? Thank you. Excusez-moi, madame. Sorry. longer to take just a minute.
Excuse me, I want to take your picture. Please, can you move over here and let me take y'all's picture together? Here, really fine. You stand there together, get these flowers. Big smile. Hold it, that's real good. Would you move your camera back just a minute?
Barbara!
All right, now this way.
Barbara, hurry up.
I'm coming.
That's a film when it was shown in 1967 bewildered most people, including the critics of the time. And it's only in the recent decades, I suppose, that it's adopted something of a cult following. Right, let's see how I do escape from this. Okay, so film represent different styles. You can use film in a critical sort of way, and you can use film in an ironic sort of way. You can also use film to generate some sense of nostalgia on the part of the audiences as well. If you look at Terence Davies's recent Of Time and the City, which is a remarkable homage to a long-vanished Liverpool from 2008, one not only devastated by the collapse of manufacturing, but also what the planners and the architects did to the city in the name of progress between the 1950s and the 1970s. It's had a remarkable reception with audiences and critics alike when it came out. And the narrative or soundtrack sometimes jars with the imagery, but he used his personal recollections when he was young of the city, not always happy, juxtaposed with other people's Super 8 home city movie footage of both old and modern Liverpool. And of course it raises the question about whose cities are we talking about here. I got a film clip of this as well, a very short one, where you can understand and appreciate this sense of juxtaposing a certain soundtrack to raise emotions with actual archival film as well.
Someday we'll build a home on a hilltop high, you and I, shiny and new, a cottage that two can fill, and we'll be pleased to be called the folks who live on the hill. Someday we may be adding a wing or two, a thing or two. We will make changes as any family will, but we will always be called the folks who live on the hill. Our veranda will command a view of meadows green, the sort of view that seems to want to be seen. And when the kids grow up and leave us, we'll sit and look at that same old view, just we two, Baby and Joe, who used to be Jack and Jill, the folks who like to be called what they have always been called, the folks who live on the hill.
So, quite emotive. And what was strange about Terence Davies's film here was the extent to which he utilised personal Cine 8 film with official documentary footage, but put a personal story on it. And as an art house type feature, it nevertheless transferred to mainstream cinemas because of its popularity, not just with the people of Liverpool, but nationwide and globally as well, and won several awards. So, what can we say about all this? Well, it's about reacting to tumultuous urban change and what sits with people's memory, with perception, how they feel about change as it's going along. And it's about dealing with uncertainty in the future modern world, which is very uncertain as well. So naturally, as Marshall Berman says, modernity comprises two elements of that sense of looking forward, of developing with modernity, developing with modern society, while at the same time creating a second reaction, which is looking backwards for security, for certainty, about knowing where you've come from. And that, of course, gives rise to nostalgia, about reminiscing, a backward glance through rose-tinted spectacles to a past that perhaps never was, as a way of coping with that sort of sense of bewildering change as it's occurring all around you. And that's what Terence Davies was evoking in Of Time and the City. So it's perhaps inevitable that societies, individuals react against the very state charged with balancing new with the past. I mean, talking about the planning profession here. But look to media and culture in more recent times for those reference points to give a sense of history and context. Well, in some cases, are we led too much by the media? I'm reminded of the TV quiz show where the contestant was asked what happened in Dallas on the 22nd of November 1963, and gave the answer, I don't know, I didn't watch it then. Which, if you like, is a tipping point where people's consciousness derives more from the media than it is perhaps from actual historic moments. So, we sometimes forget in our rush to create modern spaces like Liverpool with the best architecture, the most rational solutions to urban form, that there's a desire often in the public's mind to look backwards for comfort, to familiar and cherished scenes, and perhaps awaken conservation and heritage sensibilities. That dual look, if you like, of embracing the future and technology, interestingly enough, but also feeling the desire to look backwards for comfort or things that they recognise as change is going on all around them. And if you think about it, it's become an industry, this sense of nostalgia with places. You've only got to look at the number of blue plaques that are littered liberally around many of our cities to these days, in London especially, which are a testament, if you like, of what or who went before in very specific locations. This is not working again.
Yes. To the profile thing, and then it should work.
There we go. Yeah. So as I said, it's about being familiar with the past and how it's changing, but also a desire to think about things in a nostalgic point of view. Places we recognise instantly and want to protect, but also we want to memorialize in some ways by the attachment of different plaques. And these sort of sense of memorials relate to people who were associated with certain buildings or certain locations in the city, or indeed reflect events that might have happened in history, which causes tumultuous change, such as in this case the Great Fire in 1666 and the removal of a church that once was there, or indeed in more recent times, in this case in the Barbican, the first bomb that fell and started to decimate that area and led to the eventual building of the Barbican as well. But it's even in more recent times about what these things represent as well. So let's have a think what Doreen Massey says about some of these things as well. And she says, if space is rather simultaneity of stories so far, then places are collections of those stories, articulations within the wider power geometrics of space. And essentially that's what these memorials are. They testament, if you like, to what or who went before. You can't see them, but nevertheless it has some sort of power over what we expect to find in these locations. And in fact there are scores and scores of books, guidebooks available now about the guides, blue plaque guides to different places. So you search out and go on walking tours of these memorial walks in many ways. The sorts of architecture and planning we created after these immense upheavals create their own sets of emotions with public and audiences alike. And they seem to be either loved or loathed, depending on your viewpoint and your view of modern architecture of the modern period, essentially between the 1940s and the 1970s, where you look at that, and that's the library in Portsmouth, or the Arndale Centre in Manchester, and it has its own baggage associated with it. It has its own talking points that the residents and visitors talk about as well. And it's loved or loathed in the sense that even this example of Birmingham Central Library, where calls are for its demolition rather than its protection as an architectural icon. And we all have views of it. Or Trellick Tower, and the myths surrounding Trellick Tower in London about how the architect threw himself off the top of it, which is of course a myth, not true. Even though the bridges across between the service lift shaft and the bridges are modelled on intercity railway carriages, and that is true. Barbican, you either love it or hate it, and it's testament to of the different views that you get about these sorts of post-war developments by a Radio 4 Today programme poll some years ago, which sought to ask listeners for, in their view, the best and the worst 20th century buildings. And the Barbican came top in both categories, which, if you like, is an example of how opinion is split about these post-war developments as well. Leonie Sandercock says, in the post-war rush to turn planning into applied science, much was ignored. The city of memory, of desire, of spirit, the importance of place, the art of placemaking, the local knowledges written into stones and memories of communities. And this is why I'm interested in this, that these things are there, these emotions are there, but they haven't been captured very well to date by planners and architects, other than through memorialising them. And I think it's time that we embrace these things. There were people writing at the time, through the 1930s through to the 1980s, about the effects of change, including J.B. Priestley, there in his statue overlooking what happened in Bradford, or even with John Batchman, with his statue at St. Pancras, and, if you like, the views of both literati figures there about what was happening in this creation of the modern world, and a feeling of insecurity by it, or a dislike for certain styles of architecture. And Bettman especially using film almost in a total propaganda way to espouse his anti-modern architecture views and celebrate Victorian or Georgian architecture rather than with the modernist creations that were being created around it. And Batchman was a skilled performer on radio, television and film, where he knew exactly which buttons to press to get his views across, and more importantly, communicate these to a mass audience. And that's what television and film allowed, more so than the expert communicating through a series of public meetings on planning related issues. This was someone broadcasting directly into people's homes in a time or pre-public consultation processes in order to generate views and generate a reaction against, if you like, those professionals charged with change. I've got a film of Batchman on Bath that I'll show you if I can. And it's from 1963. It's a very early film, criticising modern planning, modern architecture, and he used all the means possible to him in order to make this point, including developing a sense of irony, and as you'll hear in the film as well, mimicking the voice of a developer who's eager to raze Bath to the ground, Georgian Bath to the ground, and replace it with the sort of modern architecture that you see he concentrates on here as well.
The Englishman's house is his castle, or in this case on Bathwick Hill, a Greek villa of about 1830. And next to it, there's an Italian palace of about 1840. And if he couldn't afford that, he could at any rate have half a house in this charming semi-detached row of early Victorian houses near Prior Park. They're very plain, but they depend entirely for their effect on proportion. As in those two houses there, do you see how the window panes on the right give scale to the building, and on the left, where plate glass has been put in, the house looks blind and bombed. At the end of the road, do you notice a falling off? I can't say I do. I like those houses beyond. I like to see bold exterior plumbing, as on this new estate at Twerton. I mean, compare it with this Georgian you so much admire, Mr. Betjeman, in this back garden here. It's very dull, this. I'm glad to see that the advertising profession at this particular place has taken the opportunity to enliven the monotony with a bright note of health-giving products, showing our modern civilization and the brightness that we so vitally need here in Bath, or you might need here in Bath. On that corner, for instance, there's something really worth looking at. As a Londoner, I like to see a new building in an old setting, as here in your new tech, where the monotony of one side has been relieved very cleverly by a little projecting window. Today, building must express itself honestly and sincerely, as for instance in this feature, which might be termed the vital buttocks of the construction. As you can see, it expresses its purpose, whatever that may be, sincerely, and this causes it to blend harmoniously and naturally with the Georgian on the left there. Each age should express itself as it really feels, and you can see how this age feels about Georgian. Well, I suppose you may be right. You must know what you're talking about, as you make such a lot of money as a developer. But come with me and look at a bit of development which was never finished. Camden Crescent, Bath, 1788. And if you stand by the old buildings opposite, you can look down into the valley. Well, I can't say I'm surprised it wasn't a success. You've only got to look down in the valley here to see how people ought to be housed. And you can see too that they've had amenities supplied, Dame Nature, wildlife, silviculture, just as in front of the Royal Crescent, the same kind of thing. Well, if you think, and there is the Royal Crescent, that there's any similarity between this and what we've just seen, you must be stupid and also malevolent. There's no cause to be offensive, Mr. Batchman. I don't like the Royal Crescent, and what's more, neither you nor I have to live in it. I mean, think about Bath practically. Look at those balconies. They may be Georgian somewhere or other, but you couldn't put a kiddie's pram in them. Whereas, if you compare that with these new flats, well, a housewife could put a pram there, and I would emphasize to you that this is the age of the housewife. She has everything she requires. Everything must be hygienically packaged and temptingly displayed to the housewife. I look forward to the day when my company has razed Georgian Bath to the ground and has produced plans that will astonish the world with their beauty, boldness and enterprise. I'm glad to see it started already, and also considerably to the profit of my company and at the same time benefiting the human race.
So a fairly acidic thing. The Batchman was saying, and all in the space of 4 minutes, criticising the development industry, the planning profession, and everyone else in the process. And the thing is that he had this platform to enable him to do this, employing, if you like, quite subtle means, well, not subtle in that case so much, but nevertheless to create an act of terminal closure, using all the styles of English language to ridicule. And if you like, finding a way of doing that and communicating those ideas to a mass audience in a way that perhaps people on the other side of the equation couldn't do themselves and didn't have that access or ability to do. Emotions run high, it seems, when modern buildings are juxtaposed with historic buildings in civic settings, or when views seem to be compromised in some ways. And it reflects the subjective opinions, of course, that people hold over our ever-changing landscape. It's epitomised, of course, by this famous example, the Trinity Scott Gateshead car park, a brutal construction, and it featured in the Michael Caine film, as you probably know, Get Carter, of 1971. It wasn't in use for over 25 years, but its portrayal in the film captured public imagination with an active campaign to save the building from proposed demolition, simply because of its filmic representation. So David Clarke is correct when he asserts the city has been undeniably shaped by representations of it in the media. A Get Carter Appreciation Society being formed, reenactments being formed, not literally I hope in some cases, and Get Carter tours. And if you like, a passionate move to protect the building because of its filmic role, not only just because of its architectural role. And this is the power of the media. Think of the impact that Ken Loach's Cathy Come Home had on policy and practice after its screening in the 60s. It's this fuzziness between the real and the perceived that I find fascinating. How film often acts as a bridge between these two worlds. And it's sometimes easy to believe that we live, if you like, on a giant film set, in the case of some cities as well. Our view of the urban is affected by transport, our mobility, our frustrations not being able to move around as quickly as we would like. And even here, film plays a vital role as well. Certain types of transport being synonymous with certain cities. Red buses or route masters in London, yellow cabs with New York, for example. The design, unique, iconic design of the Paris metro, of metro trains in Chicago and car chases beneath them. Or even, for that matter, the trams of Hong Kong, and as you'll see in just a moment, the trams and cable cars of San Francisco and as well. Now, these evoke notions of place identity. You can evoke them to use them for association with certain cities, and that's why they still have a starring role today. If you look at commercials on television or films of London, you always have a red Routemaster bus going down there somewhere in order for you to contextualize that location. You know you're dealing with London when you see it on screen, and this still has this powerful impact on filmmakers as well. Film also serves to represent the city's exciting, entertaining places to be, places of play and of leisure, whether that's organized or informal in nature, against a backdrop of city parks or beaches that bring together a diversity of people. So all these are techniques used in film quite deliberately to create this unified sense of place, a place that you recognize, or a place that serves sometimes as the backdrop of narrative storylines that are important. Some of them are fictional, some of them are not actually filmed in the places they're meant to depict, but they nevertheless there as a communication device. We walk through the city using particular paths that we are used to, navigating our way through the urban streetscape, all of which creates its own sense of identity for us, where even footbridges, paths, street furniture, street signage contribute to a sense of belonging and familiarity, because somehow we know they're somehow different to other places around the globe. Maybe that's, if you like, an inherent protest against the march of globalization and creating identikit cities, identikit chain stores, and the same high streets the world over. We're looking for a sense of authenticity here, and film, of course, enhances that to some extent in times. It's also the case that certain building materials or styles used match filmmakers' desires quite well as well, and make for places which are instantly recognizable in themselves. But essentially, it's about what we're used to, and what becomes the familiar becomes a site of cherishedness in many ways, whether that's the route that we jog around on, or nevertheless find viewing platforms in very odd places like Alcatraz and use different means of transport to get there as well. It's about the routine places, not the celebrated tourist places, but the things that we take for granted that will always be there, enhanced by film, it has to be said, and television as well. These are just examples of the things I've just mentioned. I'll let the slides speak for themselves for a moment. I think also it's about the everyday places that we encounter day to day. And they might be in the form of pubs that we go to and signage associated with those places. Or it might be back streets, derelict land, boarded up premises, sadly, or even parking lots. These are areas of transition, places that are neither here or there, places that once had perhaps a social and economic purpose, but perhaps today are less successful and subject to regeneration pressures. And of course, as all this change goes on, some places become regenerated, other places then are bound up with calls for regeneration. What are the people left behind in this rush towards commercial entity and regeneration and property development of the communities that might not benefit directly from a brand new shopping centre, a shopping mall, or an entertainment complex, and who have to live cheek by jowl in deprivation next to major pockets of wealth? And that's what's happening in many of our world cities today. This, of course, all reminds us that we need to consider who's benefiting from urban transition, who's excluded from those opportunities, what the costs are socially as well as financially of different regeneration opportunities. These slides, if you like, are represented from different parts of the UK. Bright Street is in Rochdale, the site of the birthplace of Gracie Fields. That's a familiar site, unfortunately, in London, around Covent Garden. And you become used to it. As a Londoner, unfortunately, you do become used to it. I don't say you become immune from it, but you certainly become used to it as well. And all these things are happening around us. Great new enterprises, new architecture, new developments, and which serve to question bigger things about us, what we believe in, our emotions, and what are represented as well here. Is this the right path? And whether it creates an issue of resistance on the part of some people as well. The films of Patrick Keeler, if you like, show this very well indeed. London, Robinson in Space, and now Robinson in Ruins, demonstrate this eye for detail and capturing the familiar, the everyday places through entertaining journeys. I'll just click this to allow it to go on. And oblique perspectives of change. And of course, it echoes the work of J.G. Ballard and Ian Sinclair, and they're concerned with psychogeography, things which are liminal spaces, to use Andrew Higson's phrase, about you can only really get to grips with a city if you look at its underbelly. And Sinclair says this: the truth of a city divided against itself can only be revealed through a series of obscure pilgrimages, days spent crawling out onto the rim of things, the transcendent surrealism of airport perimeter roads, warehouses and reservoirs. And it's interested in filmic styles over the last 15 years. It's these sorts of locations that give rise to a whole new wave and genre of film studies and filmmaking. People are interested in those sorts of other places, the non-routine places, the non-globalized spaces, because they somehow search and depict an authenticity that perhaps you don't get in all places. So Heelys films provide this imaginative capture through the lens of the direct impacts of planning on the places the planners have left behind or sometimes forgotten about. And these are not the stuff of picture postcards or of architects and urban planners' glossy portrayals of bright spaces, shiny new spaces, palaces of capitalism. They are rather images that capture fragments of history, places that are not generating as fast as people want them to, or, as I said, of places which are left behind. There are places that perhaps some people might regard as routine or as irrelevant in the great rush for property development. But to those of us involved with urban planning and place contentions, the result is nevertheless stimulating. But to general audiences, the work might be baffling as well as rather familiar. It's a familiar style which is also found in other places as well, such as in Paul Kelly's film for Saint-Étienne, Finistère of 2002, an imaginary 24 hours in London, owes some of its ideas to aspects of Keeler's work, but is also guided in turn by a previous film from 1967, The London Nobody Knows, which in turn was heavily influenced by the writings of Ian Nairn. And John mentioned at the start that there's a talk here next week on Ian Nairn, which should be quite fascinating. Ian Nairn, in Outrage in 1955, said this: "Subtopia, as he called it, is the world of the universal low-density mess, a mean middle state, neither town or country, the annihilation of the site, the steamroller of all individuality of place to a uniform and mediocre pattern." He's writing that in 1955, and nevertheless some of the things that Paul Kelly and Patrick Heeler and others are depicting are this sense of, if you like, the routine being rolled out across the countryside, but in turn something very different being created in some sort of places. And Anthony Gormley has also said that these landscapes are the most permanent and conscious memorial to the age of mobility as much as anything else, a new landscape formed by the dominance of information and distribution rather than production. Coming on to the last few things now, let's look at different ways that film have been used recently. Someone using Google Maps to plot the location of film locations around the world as a point of interest, or following the Torchwood BBC series, a memorial wall being created in Cardiff Bay to the fictional characters who died in an explosion at the end of the series. Or increasingly this application, Extra Normal, where you can impose your own narrative and voices into an animated program, in that case, neighborhood planning and localism, would you believe? And of course, people now have this flexibility to make their own films and own commentary on the places they see around them. Equally, the state has the ability to do this as well, as Steve knows, through surveillance, through state monitoring and control, and of course through speed cameras as well. So film has lots of different benefits, and everyone in society, including the state, has that means and ability to do something about it. We recognise buildings, installations immediately from their filmic images and where they're located and where they serve to represent, from what period of history and how they are symbolic, if you like, of changing times. And you only got to put a photograph of these places up and immediately you know where we're talking about. So perhaps it's no surprise that these sorts of places are popular with filmmakers and also with those people charged with economic development in the city and municipalities themselves. The newly christened Elizabeth Tower of the Houses of Parliament, for example, being this very much an icon. And Film London, which is an organisation funded by the Mayor of London and others, deliberately have this interactive website where, as a filmmaker, you can access the ideal positions to place cameras in order to get Big Ben depicted in the film to your benefit. And of course there are charges associated with this about blocking off streets, closing streets, about film rights and film access, so it becomes commodified in many ways as well. So the representations of the urban through film, photography and other media is a highly personal one. Everyone can do it these days simply by the camera in their pocket. It's capturing emotion, observations of familiar places in ways that, as I say, social scientists, we often neglect. It's not the only way to look at the world, but it's a different way to look at the world. It captures change in environments in distinct times, able to communicate a visual presence, impact, and development, especially new development, and it provides a spatial sense of change. It can place individual events in much wider context as well. So urban forms part of this filmic narrative to represent and promote a discourse on particular social conditions of the urban existence. Film gives us this opportunity to see the cities of the immediate past and see how the stories of society are played out. And I think those of us in the built environment professions need to recognise that as well, because that's an important aspect of how we communicate with the general public and how we appreciate where the public are coming from in our contentions and in our views of places as well. Perceptions of spaces, theorizations, imaginations will all be multiple perspectives of the same place in some cases. Film and photography provides these means by which those multiple identities and understandings can be revealed. These filmic images of space and place are selective, of course, but they can be viewed as a catalyst for less static forms of space and place into perceptions. Some of these are erroneous, whereas others are genuine forms of affection. And as with Calvino's Eye on the City, the camera lens may be used to depict the multiple meanings of places to represent both difference and distinctiveness and to challenge our existing perceptions of the urban. I'll finish off with just a few quotes, namely Sandercock's. 20th century planning, in her view, and I agree with this, has failed to see cities as living places, places of work and of homes, of interactions and communication, because the 20th century planning system turned its back on questions of values, of meanings, and of the art rather than the science of city building. This is why film and photography is very important. Khanduri Massey always sort of says, space is not stable, not a cross-sectional through time. It is disruptive, it is active, and it is generative. And if space is genuinely the sphere of multiplicity, if it is a realm of multiple trajectories, as I've been trying to demonstrate, then there will be multiplicities too of imaginations, theorizations, understandings, and meanings. My final point is this. These are my headlines. Film evokes both real and imagined perspectives of place and the role of planning in imagined change. Society increasingly searches for a sense of authenticity, or maybe that's difference, a comfort zone, or identity within an increasingly globalized and homogenized environment, and film can capture that. Cultural references are starting to serve as a route into this search in a much more explicit way, because everyone now has the means to do it than ever before. And cinematic representations, even historically depicted cinematic representations, can assist us in reading the urban and portray different people's, and portray different people's emotions towards place, which sometimes are carried through into real political campaigns to protect or to advance or to somehow champion certain buildings and places because of their filmic status. Uncertain questions regarding this spatial nostalgia, why you get in a sense of attachment to a Gateshead car park because of its film role rather than any other reason. But that's interesting in itself and worthy of research in a much more explicit way. And the change in focus from urban backdrops to the meaning of living in societies is something that film gets to the very heart of. I've taken up an inordinate amount of your time, and you've coped with my inability to work technology very well, but thank you very much for listening.
I think Mark is happy to take some questions. You will have to speak into a microphone, is the price you pay. So if people could put their hands up and I'll cart the microphone around. If you could just perhaps introduce yourself and then ask away. It's even more dark than I think, or there aren't any hands up yet. Steve.
Thank you very much, Mark. My name's Steve Graham. I work in APL as well. I wondered if you could say a bit about the role of science fictional film and its relationship with cities. I think that's a very interesting sort of recursive relationship where cities become models for sci-fi projections, and then aspirations of design are then influenced by those very films.
Yeah, that's very true. And I initially I thought in the front part of the presentation, if you like, to putting up a series of filmic images representing the range of different genres, and I was going to put, you know, a Blade Runner image up being the most obvious thing to do because it's always rolled out. In fact, a Blade Runner 2 in the pipeline now, I believe as well. You're right. There's a crossover between that, and if you look at the likes of Blade Runner, if you look at more historical depictions of through sci-fi as they were made 30, 40 years ago, then you can see from a technological point of view how some things have happened and some things haven't happened. But I think that it creates its own sense of identity. Likewise, there's an incredible amount of support and fan base for sci-fi as well. And sometimes that crosses over in terms of technological advancement, as you know very well, in terms of the imagined becomes the real when it's used for defense purposes and so on, and security purposes. So yes, there is that, and in style of architecture as well.
Andy Law, APL. Just a question, a really simple one. Would you say that the development of film and the social construction of place through film has in a way replaced the social construction of place and that imaginary, which was really produced, say, in Western culture through the novel? So is there a shift from the power of the novel to the power of film? Basic question.
I think that's a good case. That's a good point to make, and I think in many ways film is increasingly replacing the novel. It's not replacing it completely because people still read, people still like reading literature and novels, but nevertheless film is becoming far more important, and maybe because it's the technological advancement now and the range of multimedia that are everywhere and the accessibility of that media, which makes film so attractive and easy to use. People still have a sense of place and construct senses of place from literature, no doubt about that. But it's the increasing importance of film which has overtaken the novel and its accessibility, I think, which is very interesting.
More questions? Patsy, you.
And you released my question that I was thinking about, but also there's this other question. If you're interested in a novel presentation of a city, one of the things, I was great good fortune, I was reading James Joyce's Ulysses, and there's a chapter there called The Wrangling Rocks, which to my mind is the best description Joyce writes musically as well as visually in his incredible, but he captures the complexity of city movement. It's really fine. But I think following on from where we're so absorbed in the visual and in film representation, what are the disadvantages of this present obsession with film?
That's a very good question, Patsy. And I think there's a crossover. It's this fuzziness between the imagined world or the fictional world, and then translating that into how you really think places are. And whether that gives rise to, I think in the case of the Gateshead car park, people know, if you like, the fictional representation of it, even though it's an actual building, and if you like, the storyline that came about with it. But it's when people translate the filmic representation into something in their own imaginations about it, and gives rise to campaigning or popular movement about actual places. And that's a danger. It was a danger of just being obsessed about multimedia and film and not getting out from your computer as much as anything else, of course. But there's a danger in mixing up maybe that's how successful film has become, where you suspend belief. You really go in for it, and you believe that these are real places. Where unlike in the old days, where in old films, if you recall, where studio landscape shots it could be identified very easily. The two people driving along the car chatting away while the screen behind them changed. It was obvious it was a film. It was a film set. But these days, if you like, with CGI as well, you can achieve absolutely anything at all. And people really believe in, perhaps in some ways, sad indictment, rather believe in what they see on screen as opposed to what actually they're facing in the real world.
Do we perhaps have a final question? It's not mandatory to be from APL to ask a question, by the way. In which case, I would invite you to just thank Mark once again for tonight's lecture. Thank you.